So let's turn our attention now to the second core foundation of JavaScript, the scope, the lexical scope system, and specifically the closure pattern that's built on top of that. This will be our most intense of our curriculum in this workshop. So expect there's a bunch of exercises that we iterate on here, 3 or 4 I think at least, exercises where we iterate on these topics, and there's a lot to get through. So definitely make sure you keep your brain fresh on these topics. If you're watching online or watching later, make sure you go back and review the material so you don't miss out. So where we want to go is first looking at how lexical scope works in terms of nesting, how these scopes nest together. Then we want to talk about a topic. How many of you have heard of hoisting before? Have you heard that term? Okay. So we're going to talk about hoisting. Hoisting's made up. It's not real. It doesn't exist. If you look at the spec, there's no existence of the word hoist because it's not a real thing. It's actually a metaphor for describing how the compiler works. And oh, by the way, did you know JavaScript is a compiled language? We're going to get into all of that stuff. So we're going to talk about some compiler theory, talk about how lexical scope is actually processed and what that means for how we interpret our code. Then we're going to look at closure specifically. How many of you have ever had or given, or maybe both, the job interview, what is closure? Anybody ever had that question or heard that question before? It's a pretty common one. I received it at least once, and I gave it probably 100 times in my capacity working as a developer. And when I would ask people in a job interview, I was brought in because I was kind of the JavaScript expert at my job or whatever. So they always wanted me to come in and like vet the candidate. Do they really know what they're talking about with JavaScript? That's why I was brought in. So I had this set of rigorous questions, and I could tell pretty quickly whether or not somebody had paid any attention to rigorously thinking about the language, or if they would just, read some Stack Overflow posts or something like that. So it doesn't take much to filter through that. But I'd ask that question, what is closure? And much more often than not, the answer I would get to that question would be something to the effect of, oh, well, it has something to do with, it's like asynchronous callbacks and like set timeout and click handlers. Okay, can you give me any more information than that? And people would stumble to articulate. And as I said up at the beginning of our course, closure is the most important concept ever invented in computing science. Why is it so important, and yet the most basic of questions can you articulate? If I were to ask you right now, if I put you on the spot and said, tell me what closure is, if you haven't seen this course before or you haven't read my book, how would you answer that question? I think it's important to have a very crisp and specific answer to that question, to know exactly what it is. And it turns out closure is not some brand new thing that I have to teach you. I just have to teach you to recognize where closure already exists in all of your existing programs. Okay, so we're going to look at closure. We want to be really familiar with that and how we use it. And finally, that leads us, our big takeaway, the big punchline here, it leads us to understanding the module pattern. And the module pattern is probably the most important pattern in all of JavaScript in terms of code organization.